Most of us grew up with a specific image of the Americas before Columbus. We were taught that the continents were vast, pristine wildernesses, sparsely populated by small, scattered tribes living in perfect harmony with nature. We were told that the land was largely empty, waiting to be settled. But modern science and historical detective work have revealed a truth that is far more disturbing and tragic than those old textbooks ever admitted. The Americas were not empty. They were teeming with millions of people managing complex civilizations that rivaled anything in Europe. The reason the land looked empty to later settlers was not because it had always been that way. It was because it had been turned into a cemetery. What happened in the years following 1492 was not just a decline or a tragedy of war. It was a biological apocalypse that wiped out between 90 and 95% of the indigenous population. Today, we are going to look past the myths and examine the horrifying reality of the disease devastation that reshaped two continents. Part 1. To understand the scale of this catastrophe, we first have to understand what was lost. For a long time, early 20th century historians, often called the low counters, estimated that only about 1 million people lived in all of North America before the Europeans arrived. They looked at the shattered, fragmented tribes of the late 19th century and assumed it had always been that way. But they were looking at the survivors of a Holocaust, not the original population. They didn't realize that the epidemic waves often traveled faster than the explorers, depopulating entire regions before a single white man ever wrote down a census. Modern scholars, using archaeology and depopulation projection, have completely overturned those old numbers. The consensus now suggests that the Western Hemisphere held between 50 and 100 million people. North America alone likely supported up to 7 million people or more. If those numbers hold true, the collapse that followed was nearly absolute. If the population dropped from 7 million to fewer than 400,000 by the year 1900, we are witnessing a loss of 95%. This exceeds the devastation of the Black Death in Europe. It wasn't just a thinning of the herd, it was the erasure of entire worlds. The reason for this extreme mortality comes down to a concept known as virgin soil epidemics. In Europe, diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza were old companions. They were endemic, meaning they were always around. Most Europeans caught them as children, and if they survived, had lifelong immunity. When an outbreak hit a European village, it mostly targeted the young. The adults, having survived childhood bouts, remained healthy enough to fetch water, stoke fires, and harvest crops. In the Americas, however, the isolation of the hemisphere meant that no one had immunity. When smallpox arrived, it didn't just hit the children, it struck 100% of the population simultaneously. This created a nightmare scenario known as simultaneous prostration. Imagine a household where the father, the mother, the grandparents, and the children are all struck down with a high fever at the exact same moment. There is no one left to bring a cup of water to a feverish child. There's no one to keep the fire going in winter. There's no one to gather food. Many victims didn't die from the virus itself. They died from dehydration, starvation, and exposure because their entire support system collapsed overnight. This was not just a biological event. It was a total societal breakdown. The people were also genetically vulnerable. Because Native American populations descended from a relatively small group of ancestors, they had less genetic diversity in their immune systems compared to Europeans, who had been living with livestock and their diseases for thousands of years. This genetic uniformity meant that once a virus figured out how to bypass one person's immune system, it could tear through the entire tribe with terrifying ease. Part 2. The first major empire to fall was the Aztec. We often hear stories about the Spanish military prowess or their steel weapons, but the true conqueror of Mexico was a virus. When Hernán Cortés first entered the Aztec capital in 1519, he saw a city that was larger and cleaner than any city in Spain. But after the Spanish were initially driven out, they left behind a lethal parting gift. African slaves and indigenous allies traveling with the Spanish were carrying smallpox. Between September and November of 1520, while Cortés was regrouping on the coast, the virus exploded in the Valley of Mexico. The Aztecs called it the Great Rash. It was a horrific plague. Chroniclers describe people covered in pustules, unable to move, lie down, or even turn over without screaming in pain. The epidemic decapitated the Aztec leadership. Cuitlahua, the brilliant military leader who had driven the Spanish out, died of smallpox after ruling for only 80 days. When the Spanish returned to lay siege to the city in 1521, they weren't fighting a healthy army. They were stepping over corpses. The streets were so filled with the dead that men could walk on nothing but bodies. The conquest of Mexico was effectively a mopping-up operation of a plague ward. But the horror in Mexico didn't end with smallpox. In the decades that followed, mysterious epidemics known as Cocolixtli struck the survivors. These outbreaks in 1545 and 1576 killed millions more, up to 80% of those who had survived the conquest. For centuries, no one knew what this disease was. Victims bled from the eyes, nose, and mouth and died within days. It terrified the Spanish doctors who had never seen anything like it. In a groundbreaking study in 2018, scientists extracted DNA from the teeth of victims buried in a mass grave from that era. They found the culprit was a type of salmonella, a bacteria that causes enteric fever similar to typhoid. It thrived because of the collapse of indigenous sanitation and the Spanish policy of forcing natives into crowded, dirty resettlement towns. Combined with a massive drought, the bacteria spread through contaminated water and food, finishing what the smallpox had started. Part 3. Further south in the Andes, the tragedy was even more striking because the disease arrived before the invaders did. The Inca Empire was connected by a massive road system that stretched for thousands of miles. These roads, built to move armies and goods, became efficient highways for infection. Around 1527, years before the conquistador Francisco Pizarro showed up, a mysterious illness swept down from the north. It killed the Inca emperor, Huayna Capac, and his designated heir within days of each other. This double death sparked a brutal civil war between the remaining brothers, Atahualpa and Huáscar, who fought over the empty throne. For 5 years, the Inca state tore itself apart. When Pizarro finally arrived with fewer than 200 men, he didn't face a unified empire. He walked into the ruins of a civil war caused by a biological disaster. The viral vanguard had shattered the Inca social order before the first Spanish sword was ever drawn. The devastation also reached places we once thought were true wilderness, like the Amazon. In 1542, the explorer Francisco de Orellana floated down the Amazon River and reported seeing a land teeming with life. He described massive villages, road networks, and armies of thousands of warriors on the water. For centuries, historians dismissed his accounts as tall tales, arguing that the Amazon soil couldn't support such large populations. Appreciate what we're uncovering? Please be sure to like the video, subscribe for more, hit that notification bell, and share your opinion in the comments. Modern archaeology has proven Orellana right. We have found vast areas of black earth, soil engineered by humans to be fertile, proving that millions lived there. So, what happened? The diseases carried by Orellana's expedition, or those trading down from the Andes, raced along the river. Because the people lived in dense clusters along the water, the infection spread with terrifying speed. By the time Europeans returned, the great civilizations had dissolved. The survivors fled into the deep forest, abandoning their complex societies to live in small, mobile bands to escape the death zones of the river. The primitive tribes of the 20th century were not people from the Stone Age. They were refugees living in the ruins of a fallen world. Part 4. In North America, the story is much the same. In the American Southeast, the explorer Hernando de Soto marched through the region in the 1540s. He traveled with a massive herd of pigs, which are perfect carriers for diseases that can jump to humans. He passed through great chiefdoms with large towns and temple mounds. When French and English explorers entered these areas a century later, the great chiefdoms were gone. The survivors had coalesced into the tribes we know today, the Creek, Choctaw, and Cherokee. These nations were actually post-apocalyptic survivor states formed from the remnants of the societies De Soto's pigs had helped destroy. Perhaps the most chilling example comes from the founding of Plymouth Colony. The story of the Pilgrims landing in a wilderness relies on the convenient fact that the land was already cleared for them. Between 1616 and 1619, a massive epidemic swept the coast of New England, wiping out 90 to 95% of the Wampanoag and Massachusetts confederacies. Recent research suggests this wasn't smallpox, but a disease called leptospirosis, spread by the urine of black rats carried on European ships. The rats contaminated the soil and water. The Native Americans, who walked barefoot and drank from local springs, were hit hard. The Europeans, wearing boots and drinking beer or cider, were spared. When the Pilgrims arrived in 1620, they chose the site of Plymouth specifically because the cornfields were already cleared. But they were cleared because everyone was dead. They found the village of Patuxet completely empty, with bones bleaching in the sun, because there had been no one left to bury the dead. The famous Native American, Squanto, had been kidnapped years earlier. When he managed to return home in 1619, he found his entire village gone. He was the last of his people. The Pilgrims literally built their colony on a graveyard. Part 5. We often think of these plagues as ancient history, but they continued well into the 19th century. The 1837 smallpox epidemic on the Great Plains is one of the most well-documented and heartbreaking examples of this destruction. In the spring of 1837, an American fur company steamboat called the St. Peter traveled up the Missouri River. The captain knew there was smallpox on board, but he refused to quarantine the boat because he didn't want to hurt his profits. The boat stopped at Fort Clark to trade with the Mandan people. The Mandan were prosperous farmers who lived in large permanent earth lodges. They were famous for their hospitality and had hosted Lewis and Clark years earlier. In the spring of 1837, there were about 1,600 to 2,000 Mandan. By October of that same year, there were only about 138 left. The mortality rate exceeded 90%. The disease tore through the crowded earth lodges. The psychological trauma was as lethal as the virus. Warriors, horrified by the disfiguring sores that stripped them of their dignity, took their own lives. Families ended the suffering of their children to spare them the agony of the disease. The stench of death was so strong that people at the trading post could smell the village from miles away. The second chief of the Mandan, a man named Four Bears, had been a lifelong friend to the white traders. As he watched his wives and children die, and as he felt the fever taking him, he delivered a final speech that condemned the betrayal. He said, "I have never called the whites dogs, but today I do pronounce them real dogs. I have been in many battles and often wounded, but the wounds I receive from my enemies I glory in. Today I am wounded, and by whom? By those dogs of whites that I considered my friends." Four Bears died shortly after, and his people were effectively erased as a sovereign nation, the few survivors eventually merging with other tribes. This history leads us to a stark conclusion. The European conquest was not a victory of civilization over savagery. It was a biological usurpation. The virgin soil epidemics acted as the shock troops of colonization, clearing the land long before the settlers arrived with their wagons and plows. They silenced the great civilizations of the Amazon and the Mississippi and shattered the empires of the Andes and Mexico. The vanishing Indian was not fading away due to natural causes. They were being erased by the most efficient killing machines in evolutionary history. The fact that Native American people survived at all, recovering from a nadir of fewer than 400,000 people in 1900 to the millions alive today, is a testament to an incredible biological and cultural resilience. But we must never forget that the wilderness of our history books was actually a hollow continent, emptied by a tragedy of unimaginable scale. Considering the sheer scale of this biological collapse, do you think our history books have done enough to tell the true story of what happened before the settlers arrived? Kick the dust off that subscribe button, tap the bell, and toss a like our way. Helps us keep these forgotten trails open.